Abishek. As much as you dislike it, React is a big part of our lives, and hence this talk. Next.js 13 has come up with this thing called React Server Components. The first thing is that if you are not sending the component to the browser, basically you are reducing the bundle size, so your component is down. And if that component is dependent on a third-party library that is big, then that is also out. What's the catch? The catch is server components are not going to be interactive. So in server components, you'll not have use state, you'll not have context, you'll not have effect, nothing of that stuff. So it's basically a very, very dumb version of what we have seen as components. When you are using a client component inside a server component, which is the most common use case, basically what Next.js has now recommended is that fetch all your data in server components, not in client components, which is kind of obvious. The whole idea of server components is that only. So you can basically attach yourself to the database and get data. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. This is a very short talk on this topic, React Server Components in Next.js. A little bit about me. I'm Abishek. I often organize ChennaiJS meetups. Other than that, I'm also a developer, full stack. And by full stack, I mean backend in Ruby and frontend in JavaScript. Of late, I have been actively, professionally a React complainer. So, so if you want to rant about React or the JavaScript ecosystem, I'm one of the few. There's a lot more like me actually in the group. So I hope you get introduced to all of them. Yeah, but as much as you dislike it, React is a big part of our lives, and hence this talk. Next.js 13 has come up with this thing called React Server Components, and whether or not we like it, we'll be seeing a lot of this. So it's better to basically get to know what it's all about. So before we begin with that, this is the first question that comes to mind. What is this server components? Do we not already have this server-side rendering thing in React, in Next.js? Those of you who have used anytime Next.js, show of hands. Most of you have. Yeah, that must, like, you have some idea of what's going on there, what SSR and SSG and all is. Yeah, so this is an addition. This is in addition to what Next.js already provides, which is SSR and SSG. This is one more thing. And this was developed by the React core team. So it's a React feature. On top of it, Next.js has built up their project. Server components is being provided by React. Server components were launched actually 2 years back in December 2020. Dan Abramov announced it. It was actually intended, focused at framework writers only. So frameworks such as Next.js and others are the target audience of that feature. They have to basically use it to build their whole thing. And Next.js, I think, as far as I know, Next.js is the first framework that has come up with an implementation for the server components. So a quick differentiation between SSR and server components. So what happens in SSR is we have a React component, we render it on the server side with some initial data, and we send it to the browser along with the component. So the component, the JavaScript of the component also goes along with everything. And then it is hydrated. Hydrated means interactivity is added. Basically, event handlers and all, it becomes interactive. So that's how SSR works. So server component is also a React component that gets rendered on server, but it will never go on the client. So the component itself will never be sent to the browser. So that's the biggest difference. And that's like a goal that has been in my reading, that has been there for a long time. Like we should have some kind of component that is not sent to the browser at all, and what the benefits will be, we'll see. So yeah, that's the first thing only. What's the use? Why do we want to do something like that? So the first thing is that if you are not sending the component to the browser, basically you are reducing the bundle size. So your component is down. And if that component is dependent on a third-party library that is big, then that is also out. So your bundle size cuts down well significantly if you have a heavy dependency. And the second thing is that you can perform operations that are not typically possible in a component in a server component, which, for example, anything that you do on the server side, the file system access, database access, those sort of things. Anything that has to do with secrets, you could do now because you know that code is never going to the browser. So these are the stated benefits. What's the catch? The catch is server components are not going to be interactive. So in server components, you'll not have use state, you'll not have context, you'll not have effect, nothing of that stuff. So it's basically a very, very dumb version of what we have seen as components. Now, this is a very basic example. It's just a normal component, which arbitrary heavy library is imported. It uses it. In Next.js, now going forward, all the code we'll see is from Next.js because Next.js is the only practical implementation right now. So what Next.js has done is that Next.js 13 has come up with a lot of big changes. Okay, this is just one big part of it. So one thing they have introduced is an app folder. So previously Next.js was pages folder and all around pages folder. That was the essential folder or the central point of the Next.js app. Now it's the app folder. And what they say is that any component inside the app folder by default is a server component. So they will render it, they will try to render it on the server side. So inside the app directory, if your component resides, it better be server component. And if you want interactivity to it, then you have to say explicitly that this is a client component using the use client directive on top. So with that directive, Next.js knows that this is a client component, which means that this component can go to the client. This component can still do all the fancy stuff that Next.js has been doing. SSR can happen, SSG can happen, all that stuff can happen with this component. Of course, when it's in the right place, it has to be a page and get static props and all those things should be there. But so what they did is basically that if you don't declare anything, they'll assume it's a server component. And if you want it to be interactive and like a normal component, just use client. So this is the only difference that looks like exists in the beginning. Okay. Then what they promise is that you can call or you can include server components inside client components and client components inside server components. Basically, both kinds of components can be used intermingled as you need. Okay, so this is where the complication starts. Okay, as you can see, there is an asterisk with conditions apply. So this is an example where the previous client component, this one, I have included it in the server component, just like a normal React component. So this is a diagram from their documentation. Basically, you can mix and match any way you need. It's not nearly as easy as they show it. So we'll get to that. Not nearly as simple, actually. Yeah, so this, just for reference, so they announced it in December 2020. Dan Abramov posted a very big video. You have to go through it like it's like a 55 minutes long or something. Next.js 13 incorporate. Okay, these are all the things I've already mentioned. These are the references. Basically, all right. So as I was saying, conditions apply. The devil is in the detail. So what all complications are we looking at when we try building Next.js apps using server components? Now, server components, my prediction is everybody will try to use because any tiny bit of performance gain that you are likely to get, you want to get that. Okay, and all sorts of gymnastics you have to do for that, you will do. Okay, at least that's what happens in React world. So let's see what all gymnastics we are going to do. This is a list that I made. Actually, there may be more. So first thing is that when we include a client component. Okay, wait, before we go ahead, any questions so far? Because this is where we are starting the hairy area. So before that, anything around the basics that you guys want to discuss?
No? If there's a page, okay, and we have only one component, that one component will alone be come from server.
Yeah.
Okay. Not a whole page.
If you want, the whole page can also be like that. The whole page can be a server component. I mean, these are matter of defaults actually. So the way they are saying is pages directory will still be there, but anything that goes inside the app directory, they are saying that it will be a server component. So the idea is that you start from server components and add client components as you add interactivity. Okay, so the first catch is that when you are using a client component inside a server component, which is the most common use case, obviously you're going to pass your data through props to the client component. The idea being that all your data fetching and loading and all that will happen in server component. So this server component where I have x equal to hello, this is where we might call our APIs or database or whatever, get the data, and then we move it to we pass all the data to the client component where it will become interactive. That data has to be serializable. Okay, so which means that it should look like data basically. It should have numbers, strings, objects of numbers, strings, arrays, those sort of things, not functions. So anything that is not serializable cannot be passed from server component to client component. That is one restriction. Okay, so which means that any patterns that we have been using where we pass functions and then call those functions, none of that. If you look at it that from a like pure networking point of view, this makes sense because your server component is something that is getting rendered on the server and client component has to get rendered on the client. And in between, there is a whole internet. Okay, so what looks like prop to us is actually data that is going over the wire. So it has to be in a shape that can be transmitted on the wire. So that's a first constraint here.
Will it throw any errors you try to pass?
Yeah, it will throw errors. Basically, build errors. All right, then the other side of it. When I have a client component and I want to call a server component inside it. Now, this might be a little awkward to imagine. Why would I call a server component inside a client component? Like, think of it as a page. Like in island architecture, what he described, that page is mostly like non-interactive elements. At least the layout is mostly non-interactive, and there are pieces of interaction in between. That's how most websites are. So the broader frame is usually non-interactive, so you can design it as a server component, and then the interactive part can be client component, and client component goes inside the server component. So this is how actually we imagine most websites should be built. But in React land, client components are more likely to be there on the top. And the reason is that in React land, we use a lot of context on top. And context always has to be client component because server components cannot have context. Okay, so that is a background of the reasoning behind why I would include a server component inside a client. When you try doing that, you can include it, but you cannot import it. Okay, so inside a client component, if you do import my server component, the build will fail. This is not allowed. Okay, so and the reasoning behind it is that the code of the server component is not allowed to go into the client component. So the server component can be rendered and the rendered output can go. Okay, but the code itself cannot be allowed to go. So that's a small hairy distinction to make. It came as a surprise to me when I was reading it.
Understand it clearly. For example, like an API call and doing some other functionalities. So things I can keep it in the server component, and the HTML tags, elements, and so things can be keep in the client component. So this is the
General
my understanding is correct, right?
Yeah. So wherever you have event handlers, client component, wherever you have data, and the frame server component.
So when you say it's rendering in server, how do the sessions are handled? Like for example, there's a wall box where the user name is going to be printed. If you are logging in, your name will be printed. If I am logging, my name will be printed.
Yeah.
So if that's the server component means, then how do the server maintain the sessions?
So that's not a that's slightly out of scope of this, but let's go into it. Sessions are always maintained on the server anyway, right? Server knows a session, right? Like it will, cookies or whatever the technology is. So while rendering the server component, the server has the information because it will have the request, your request object. Okay.
Along with JWT, we need to
Along the technology you are using for maintaining sessions, all that is available to the server component. Okay, so the server component can render user-specific information within itself.
We can keep it in the session storage, right? So it will be renewed once the API is hitting. So this option will be helpful for you.
For client components, I need to maintain JWT. For server components, I need to maintain session.
No, actually, so I'm talking more on a generic level that the restrictions on the server components are less. So server component can use basically all the technology related to session handling that is available to a typical server-side application. So if we write a server-side node application, it will have access to session and JWT and all sorts of database, everything. That whole thing can be used in a server component also. Okay, but client components, as it has always been, client components don't maintain these kind of things. Clients are just clients. So they can do what the browser allows them to do. So they are restricted in the same way as before.
Usually, when we import, we say where the file path goes, right? So
Yeah.
Since we can't import, which means like all the names should be unique for each server-side component or something like that. All the names are available globally. How does this?
On the naming, there is no recommended convention, or maybe there is but that far I have not seen yet. I guess what you're saying is that we should not have a name clash between server-side and client-side client components.
Even between server components, usually we have different folders, and within each folder we can have the same thing, same name repeated, right? Same component name repeated.
Okay.
But since we can't, so how do we? So if I have like two components with the same name, and I try to use that in a client.
Also, okay, so if you have two components with the same name, that's a problem even outside of the system. So if you have two components with the same name that you want to include in a module, if you have two modules with the same name, okay, like let's say where some very common module name like render. Okay, now render is coming from this library also. I have my own render also. There's a way to solve that problem. We use as keyword.
Yes.
So those same techniques.
He's asking in this case, no, you can't import. So even if the file name is same, the folder name is different or the path is different, then they are unique.
Okay.
But in this case, since you can't import the server components inside client, how do we include it?
Yeah, I'm getting to that. That's the next slide. We are supposed to use this pattern basically to include a server component inside the client component. So on the left, we have server component, the black one, the yellow one is a client component. So what basically we are doing is that we are creating a master server, like another parent server component. And in server components, we can call both kinds. So we can import both kinds. So we are importing both kinds of server components. And then as a render prop, basically as a child of the client component, we are adding the server component. And inside the client component, basically we are using children. This is a very common pattern in React world. So we have to rely on this pattern to allow server components inside client. So
is it restricted to the prop children, or you can pass it as a prop?
I think you can pass it as a prop. You can pass it.
The gymnastics you have to do to get the performance.
There's some more. Okay, so there is this thing called poisoning. So, so poisoning is now because we have basically have server components and client components intermingled, which means server-side code and client-side code is likely to be very close to each other. There is a chance by accident that you call a function that is supposed to be called only in the server side or in the server components. You can call it in the client component also. So as you saw in the previous section, the restriction is on importing a server component only. Okay. But for any other module in the world, you can still import it inside your client components. Okay. So if you have a module where you have written some very super secret algorithm that should never go to the browser, accidentally somebody can call it and send it to the browser. So that is called poisoning. And that's actually a pretty common scenario, not with super secret algorithms, but when we write fetching code basically, or any code that involves env. Okay. So it looks like it can work in both, like we are getting data from third-party service, let's say, and it uses some tokens and keys and stuff. Okay, and it uses fetch basically, fetch or Axios or something. From a look of the code, it will seem like that it can be called inside the client as well, inside the browser as well, and it can be called on the server as well. But the problem is that those tokens and all which are coming from your env, that might not be available to the client side. There are ways to restrict that in Next, and basically every framework has some ways to restrict that. So by accident, if you call it, it will go on the client and it will not work, it will fail. So that is a more common example of poisoning. To prevent that, they have created an NPM package called server only. And if you put that server only package, that particular module cannot be included in a client component. So yeah, that's actually that's a clever technique to do that. And you'll have like an annotation also that, okay, this is a server. That's the solution. Okay, and yeah, one more bit. How to use third-party components. So third-party libraries we use a lot for components like carousel, slider, n number of things we use. Bootstrap, material, a lot of things come from them. So those cannot be used obviously inside your server components because those don't. I mean, for Next.js, they are not client components. They are just because they don't have that annotation, use client annotation in their code. So their code will be treated like a server component and it will fail because they're interactive, they have state. So to avoid that, how to basically use third-party libraries, a little bit of gymnastics, write a wrapper. So write a client component that includes that library, add that annotation of use client, and then use it in your server component. Then it will. Yeah, if you include in client component, it is fine. Or if that library has that annotation already, then also it's fine.
Using that in a client-side component, again you are wrapping, right? Basically.
No, in client-side component, you don't need to wrap.
No, it's essentially like it has the use state and it is importing that, so it's like wrapping again. It's not a wrapper, but
I think so. Yeah. All right, and this is the final bit. So the new recommendation in Next.js is data loading. There is a whole lot of changes in data loading also in Next.js that deserves its own session. I'm only covering this bit that affects us for server components. Basically, what Next.js has now recommended is that fetch all your data in server components, not in client components, which is kind of obvious. The whole idea of server components is that only. So you can basically attach yourself to the database and get data. That is great. The second point is that fetch your data in each component that needs it. So if you have 4 server components for different parts of the page, one has like user information, one has something else, profile information, one has number of posts, those sort of things. In each of their respective components, you must load that data, the data that component needs. Now, this is not what we usually do in React. What we usually do is we load as much data as possible in a single go in a top level component somewhere and maybe provide it as, usually go for something like Redux or state management where this data is handled. Or if not, then use context APIs and pass it along. If not context, then pass it along using props, basically props drilling. So you pass on the data through props. That's not what they are recommending now. All your components fetch their data on their own, basically keep them independent, keep them decoupled. And they have implemented something like a deduplication, basically a fetch cache they have implemented. So multiple fetches to the same data store, they won't basically execute. They will get short circuited through a cache. So they have that optimization in place. Actually, I like this part actually, where basically you can decouple your component and fetch its data separately. So that this bit actually I like. So, but yeah, this is a little bit of departure from the way a lot of projects work. That's all. That's all I have now.
So for the cache part, is the cache is on the front end side for not fetching the data again and again, like that?
No.
Cache is on.
This is the whole thing is because fetch data in server components.
Okay,
So if you have a server component A, another server component B, another one C, all three are fetching by chance the same data, then they will use the cache.
you have to like get the data from server component and then pass it to the client component, right?
Yes.
That means that actually you are pre-rendering and then sending it, or the client component goes to the browser and then fetching the data.
There won't be network call. There won't be network.
There won't be, so it will pre-render and then
See, server component will get rendered on server only.
Hmm.
So that qualifies for pre-rendering. Now your client component will go to the client nevertheless. Okay. Now whether it gets pre-rendered or not, that depends on the way you have written your SSR logic.
like, because like maybe there could be a logic where I'm getting some data, like on a trigger, some trigger happens, then I'm trying to fetch some data, right? For example, carousel let's say, you want more images, let's say, right? And then if I press the next button and then next image loads in. So again, then that's a fetch, right? So if let's say I have two carousels like that, is the cache is on the front-end side or
That is interactive.
This cache feature is available only on the server side, only in server components. You can design your applications in such a way that all the data it needs before interactivity begins, you fetch all of it and pass it on to client components. So in your case, carousel, I would imagine pre-fetching all the images in my server component and passing them along. That is one design. But suppose if there are thousands of images or if there is some interactivity involved, then I might do a client-side fetch as well. So the client-side fetch doesn't get the benefit of this feature.
okay. Because I was thinking about that use query is there because they do all this caching work on the client side of things.
Yes. So I think those things will still work. Those things will still work. We'll have to use those things anyway. Yeah, so that's all I have. Just wanted to show this once again. I don't have a demo at the moment. Like, any more questions?
I think this way of writing code, right? Would it actually lead to elimination of writing like data fetching in the client side? Not lesser, because we can actually have the power to pass those values as props from your server side component to a client side component.
Yes.
At the back end, so you are eliminating where we have a collection or something which needs to be represented in the UI as a chart or something. We can just have that server component fetch the data for you and send it as the props for its client component, and then that gets rendered.
Yes.
So that means you are seeing like probably
Actually, this pattern, the idea that basically all the data that your components need should be fetched on the server side and should not be sent, should basically render the component, send it to the client. So this idea has picked up a lot of popularity. Even Remix, the framework, they actually have a load function on top of every component. So basically, next to every component, you will have a loader in which you are supposed to write the code that loads the data for that particular component. So what you're saying is one of the goals of this whole exercise, and that's a good thing. Like instead of fetching the initial data from the client, which means that there is something to view before interactivity begins. Always, when our site begins itself, there is some HTML to show for viewing or for what is that called, SEO, those sort of things. However, that problem was partially solved already using SSR. Okay, so this is like an extension in that effort, that an addition to that effort.
Feels like we are going back to old school.
Where we render everything on the server. It does feel like that. Yeah.
It's like you're writing PHP with JavaScript.
The PHP.
I used to do whenever you want to pass some PHP data, you just append it to
So you know the
variable, JS variable, and just pass it.
It does feel like that actually, and the way it's moving. If you see Remix is actually built a lot in that sentiment itself, and people who did not, decided not to learn React at all. Some of my friends are like that because I am from that era, that PHP era. So some of my friends decided that no, we are not going to do this craziness at all. Okay, and now in 2022, they are talking to us and asking you what is going on. why everything is moving to server side? What are you guys trying to do?
You guys said that server side is gone and client side is new thing on that day.
Yeah.
Now you are saying that server side is the new.
But still the user experience is still better. So we have client components, right? So the loading states can be effectively managed. You can only render parts of it in server, and this can be still have the loading indicator. And you don't have
Yeah,
to
when
wait
you
for
go
it.
into the details, you will find a lot of benefits to all that has happened.
But at a high level,
But at a high level, this argument always comes up.
All we invented all these SPAs because we wanted that skeleton loader. That is what for at least instead of the skeleton loader, we made all these gymnastics. Oh, nice! Facebook has it because we have that. We don't want that refresh.
but the final application, we need all the functionalities, all the components, everything, but it will load within 1 second. This is not all the explanation.
That is user's expectation.
Exactly.
No, initially the SPAs and all that we saw, like for example, Gmail. Gmail was like one of the first popular SPAs. They worked so fast and so well that everybody thought, okay, let's let the loader go for a few seconds, and after that it will act like a native application. There was a charm for that. Anyway, so I'll wrap it up here. And I think that's what wraps up our meetup. You can stop the recording maybe.
Okay, so.
Thank you.